Is this the most effective attacking formation white can have in a game of chess? I'm talking, of course, about the isolated queen's pawn formation. We've done one video on this. This is the second video looking at the attacking potential white has in an isolated queen pawn structure. You remember the first video, we saw that advancing and liquidating the pawn in the center gave white the best chance of an attack, or black if they have the IQP. In this case, we're going to look and see what happens when black prevents the advance of that pawn. What are some of the other attacking options white has? And if you can recreate this structure and really learn it, you can have one great attacking game after another and really tear apart your opponent's king. This game is an example of that. This game was was between Ettiene Bacrot, who had the white pieces, and Romain Edouard, who had black, both grandmasters. Bacrot was over 2,700 when this game was played. Let's take a look. Let's get through the opening quickly so we can look at the main structure, the IQP, the isolated queen's pawn. So d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, takes e3, e6. You have a basic queen's gambit accepted. a6, castles, c5, bishop back, knight c6, knight c3, cd4, ed4, bishop e7. So now we have the isolated queen's pawn. It's the queen's pawn because it's the pawn that's in front of the queen, and it is isolated because there are no pawns, no pawns on either side of it. So, how do we use this pawn, this IQP, to attack if we are not able to advance it to d5? Well, here are a few of the maneuvers white has at their disposal in this structure. And again, I'm talking from the white side. Black could be the side with the IQP, but we'll talk as if white has it, because in this game, white does. One attacking possibility is to play the bishop to c2 and the queen to d3 and create an attacking battery on this b1, h7 diagonal, aiming at a castled king, potentially even delivering mate on the h7 square. Another attacking possibility is to place the knight at f3 on e5. One of the advantages of having this pawn is that it creates this support square at e5. If the knight is captured and the pawn recaptures, white has space and it can kick away this knight on f6. Also, the rook lift is a very common thematic idea. The rook might go to e1, e3, and if this knight is not here, it can shift to g3 or h3 to aid in the attack on the castled king. And if at some point black plays the move h6, the sacrifice, bishop takes h6, opening up a castled king, is another thematic idea. So there are a number of thematic attacking maneuvers white has in an IQP, and this game has quite a few of those maneuvers in it. Bacrot, again with the white pieces, plays bishop to g5, castles, queen to d2. Basically, he just wants to centralize his two rooks on the e and d1 squares and then attack from there. Bishop to d7, rook a to d1. Now here Edouard plays a strong move. He plays the move knight to a5. As we discussed in the earlier video on the IQP, white wants to liquidate on this d5 square. By playing knight to a5, he pushes the bishop away from its control of d5, making it much harder for white to play that advance. So the bishop goes back to c2. The bishop is much too valuable to be exchanged for that knight. Knight to c4. Now queen to e2, hitting the knight. And Edouard decides to support the knight with rook to c8. As it turns out, it looks risky, but the better move was to just go ahead and take this pawn. And after rook to b1, rook to c1 would be equal. But if white played rook to b1, then after rook to c8, rook takes knight, rook takes c3, you'd have a fairly equal position. Black might even be a little better, but if white decided to get greedy and take the pawn at b7, black would actually be winning. After bishop to b5, skewering the queen and the rook, queen to d2, and then queen to c8, defends the rook at c3 and attacks the rook at b7 and f1, and black would just be winning in that case. So he could have equalized after knight b2, but he supports the knight with rook c8. The bishop goes back to the b3 square, where it really wants to be, and now he can't really go back to a5, because now white can play d5. And if the pawn takes, bishop takes, you exchange Here white has a very strong position with a good development in an open center with pins on the board. He would have been in good shape, and if black retakes the bishop, then you play the pawn to d6. In this case, after the knight retreat, pawn takes, queen takes, and then this spectacular move, knight to d5, with pins all over the board. The e-pawn is pinned because of the queen, the knight is pinned because of the bishop, and after queen to d8 to remove those pins, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop to h6, and if he tries to save the rook with rook to e8, then knight to e5 would be crushing, attacking the d7 bishop, the rook and the knight, but also threatening queen to g4 check, and when the king moves, queen to g7 will be checkmate. So he would just be losing there. So knight to a5 is not a strong move. So he plays b5, supporting the knight. Now we see a thematic idea. The knight hops into e5. That's a nice square for a knight in an isolated queen's pawn position. The knight goes back to b6. Again, he wants to keep some control over this d5 square. Rook f to e1. Bacrot finishes his development and centralizes his final rook. So Edouard plays h6. So now we see the second thematic isolated queen's pawn attacking maneuver. He takes the pawn at h6. He sacrifices the bishop, and all he gets back is a pawn. And this is really a positional attacking sacrifice. There's no forced win here for white. It's not like accepting that sacrifice leads just to a clear win. This is a move that says, now I'm going to have a long attacking sequence. Let's see if you can defend. And computers actually see this as an equal position. So this is an effective sacrifice, and it's going to be hard to defend, even though it's not a forced loss by any stretch. So now we see the third thematic isolated queen's pawn maneuver, the rook lift. Rook goes to d3 with the idea of shifting to g3 or h3 to attack the king at g8. The king moves to h8. If black were to get aggressive here and say play b4, trying to kick the knight away, they would be in big trouble. Bacrot would ignore that threat and play rook to g3 check. When the king moves, the bishop goes to c2, again, potentially setting up that b1h7 battery we talked about earlier. If pawn takes knight, queen to e3, attacking the h6 pawn, knight to g8 defending it, sacrifice the exchange, rook takes knight, king takes, now queen to h6, with the threat of mate on h7. And this is an amazing sequence. If it had been played over the board, it would really have been spectacular. f5 blocks that diagonal, but white's crushing move here, really amazing. Rook to e4, wow! Threatening rook to g4, check, and if the pawn were to take the rook, you'd have mate at h7 just the same. So you have to take the rook, but then queen to g6 check, king h8, bishop takes e4, threatening mate on h7, and mate is unavoidable. If black blocks that diagonal with the rook by playing rook to f5, then just bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop, knight to f7, check, mate. With the only two pieces white has left on the board, black has all of these useless pieces doing nothing. White only has two pieces, but they're delivering mate. That variation is an example of how potent these attacks can be. But instead of b4, he plays a safer move, king to h8. Queen goes to d2, aiming at h6, but also preparing. He's still eyeing the possibility of playing d5 here. That's still on the board. Knight goes to g8, and now d5. And again, computers think black can defend, but I would never want this position. It's just way, way too dangerous. ed5, I think, might be an idea for black to survive, but if knight takes, knight c4, queen to c3, sets up threats along this long diagonal, discoveries. Knight takes, queen takes, bishop f6 blocking, knight takes, doubling, and pinning the bishop at d7, rook e8 counterattacking the queen, but then rook d7, queen f6 check, king h7, and g3. And basically, you have an equal position. Black is up in exchange, but white has a pawn and a safer king. So it's a competitive position. I think I'd still rather have white, though. But after d5, black plays knight to c4. And after bishop takes knight, pawn takes, the rook goes up to d4. Now, there's really only one move to defend here. One of the problems black has, again, is all of this pressure down the d-file as soon as these pawns are exchanged. So queen to e8, moving out of that pin, I think is really the only move to survive. He plays bishop to c5, trying to push that rook away, but Bacrot does not move the rook. Pawn takes pawn, now opening up the threats along the d-file. Bishop takes rook, queen takes rook. Now there's a threat to the bishop at d7, but also a discovered check, even a double check, threatened along this diagonal. Knight f7 check would be a double check. So he has to block that discovered check. Has no choice. If he plays bishop e6, then knight to f7 check would just win the house. So queen to f6 blocks that diagonal. Pawn takes bishop. The rook has to move. Rook to e3, another rook lift. He lifted the first rook, now he's lifting the second rook, but what he wants to do is push the queen away from this f6 square by moving the rook to f3. Get the queen out of there, off the diagonal if possible. Knight to e7, rook to f3, hits the queen, but instead of moving the queen, Edouard plays knight to c6, counterattacking white's queen, but that doesn't work. And Bacrot plays knight takes f7 check, and his opponent resigns in this position. He obviously has to deal with the check. If he takes with the rook, then just queen f6, rook takes f6. And now it's rook and knight versus rook and knight, but white has a decisive material advantage. He's up 3 pawns and has all kinds of pressure against the h6 pawn, the knight at c6, and that's a resignable position. So this is the second video, and the final video on playing with the isolated queen's pawn, and this just shows some of the potency, some of the incredible attacking potential of possessing the isolated queen's pawn. Next time we're going to see how to play against it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it educational as I did. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.